The phone buzzed against the scarred metal of my workbench, a furious, insistent vibration that cut right through the Tuesday morning quiet. I ignored it. I was in the zone, meticulously cleaning the carbon scoring off a power converter from a gig last month. It was meditative work. The scent of citrus-based solvent, the satisfying scrape of the wire brush, the suburban symphony of a distant lawnmower. This was my version of a day spa. Peace, quiet, a distinct lack of people creating problems that required my immediate and usually expensive intervention. The phone buzzed again, this time with the frantic energy of a hornet trapped in a jar. I sighed, wiping my greasy hands on a rag. It was Dr. Sharma. Good client, bad sign. Dr. Sharma only called when something was on fire, sometimes literally. Atlas Remote Solutions. This is Jack, I answered, my voice already shifting into what my ex used to call my triage mode. Jack, thank God! Her voice was tight, stretched thin with panic. The power, it's out, it's just off. I leaned against the workbench. Okay, Anya, slow down. A blackout? No, that's the thing. I called the utility company. The grid is fine, it's just us. The breaker at the pole, it's been shut off. And someone put a new lock on the box. I stood up straight. A new lock. That wasn't a squirrel-chewed wire or a blown transformer. That was deliberate. How are the refrigerators? I asked, my mind already flipping through a mental inventory of my gear. The backup batteries are holding, but they're only rated for an hour. 60 minutes, Jack. I have 100 vials of the Pfizer vaccine in there, not to mention the dozens of senior citizens who are waiting outside in this heat. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a music festival with warm beer. This was a free vaccine clinic she was running in the small commercial space at the entrance to my subdivision. This was medicine for old folks. Did anything weird happen before the power went out? I asked, already walking towards my truck, keys in hand. There was a woman, Dr. Sharma said, her voice dropping, from the HOA. She was complaining. Something about undue traffic and our sign not conforming to aesthetic standards. I stopped dead in my garage. I closed my eyes. A picture formed in my mind, as clear and unwelcome as a tax audit. Impeccably styled blonde hair that looked like it would shatter if you touched it. A pastel pantsuit, and a clipboard, held with the righteous fury of a prophet wielding stone tablets. Brenda. Anya, was this woman about 5'5", and did she look at you like you were something she'd just scraped off her shoe? A beat of stunned silence. Yes. How did you know? I grabbed my heaviest mag light from its charger, not because it was dark, but because it had a satisfying heft. Because I have the profound misfortune of being her neighbor. Don't worry, I've got a solution for this particular brand of crazy. I'll be there in 10 minutes. I hung up the phone and looked at the beast hitched to the back of my F-250. It was a mobile, hyper-silent, medical-grade generator I affectionately called the Juice Moose. It was designed to power a field hospital in a hurricane. Today it was going to war with the Oak Meadows Homeowners Association. This was no longer a peaceful Tuesday. This was an operation. Pulling up to the clinic was like arriving at a low-stakes disaster zone. A line of about 30 senior citizens, some with walkers, some with canes, were scattered along the manicured sidewalk, fanning themselves with whatever they could find. They looked confused and irritable, which was perfectly understandable when you're 85 and someone has turned off the air conditioning in July. Dr. Sharma, a whirlwind of controlled panic in blue scrubs, was moving between them, handing out bottled water and offering apologies. And there, standing guard by the main utility pole like a troll under a bridge, was Brenda. She had her arms crossed, her chin held high, and a look of profound satisfaction on her face. It was the look of someone who had just perfectly parallel parked on the first try, or in her case, successfully weaponized a public utility against a charity. I parked my massive truck and its even more massive trailer in two perfectly legal, clearly marked parking spots. The rumble of the power-stroke diesel engine was the only sound for a moment. Every head turned. I hopped out, leaving the engine running. "Brenda," I said, my voice calm and even. "It's a trick I learned in the Army. The more chaotic the situation, the quieter you get. It unnerves people." She turned to me, a slow, deliberate movement. "Jackson, I see you've chosen to involve yourself." She didn't call me Jack. Nobody called me Jackson except my mother when I was in trouble. "I was invited," I said, gesturing to the clinic. "Dr. Sharma is a client. What seems to be the problem here, other than the fact you've cut power to a medical facility in the middle of a heat wave?" Brenda's smile was thin and sharp. "This establishment," she said, using air quotes as if the word itself were contaminated, "is in clear violation of HOA bylaw 74C regarding temporary commercial enterprises causing undue neighborhood disruption. They are attracting a transient element." I looked over at 80-year-old Mrs. Gable, who was patiently waiting in a fold-out chair she'd brought from home. She was about as transient as a sequoia. "You mean your neighbors, Brenda? The people who live 3 streets over?" "Furthermore," she pressed on, ignoring me and tapping her clipboard with a perfectly manicured nail, "their signage violates Section 12. B's aesthetic code. The font is unapproved. I informed them of this, and when they refused to cease operations immediately, I was forced to take action." I stared at the brand-new heavy-duty padlock on the utility box. It was a master lock. A good one, too. "Action? You can't just cut power to a building, Brenda. Did you physically cut the lock that the power company put on there?" She puffed out her chest. It was a subtle movement, but it radiated smugness. "I am the president of this association. I have master keys to all common utility access points for emergency maintenance." My jaw actually dropped. "And you deemed this an aesthetic emergency?" I gestured to the wilting crowd. "These are your neighbors. That's Mr. Gable from down the street. Inside that building are thousands of dollars worth of vaccines that are about to turn into expensive water. You haven't just created an inconvenience, you've created a public health hazard." Brenda was completely unmoved. Her eyes were as cold and unforgiving as a winter morning. "The rules are the rules, Jackson. They were established to protect our property values and maintain a certain standard of living. If these people want their shots, they can go to the county health department like everyone else. This is a residential community, not a free-for-all." I looked from her smug, unyielding face to Dr. Sharma's desperate one. I looked at the elderly people, sweating under the midday sun, and I looked at the shiny new lock on the power box. All this because of an unapproved font. I had dealt with insurgents who had more flexible worldviews. There was no reasoning here. There was no appeal to decency or logic. There was only the rule book, as interpreted by a tyrant in a turquoise pantsuit. I felt the familiar click in my brain, the switch from negotiation to problem-solving. And Brenda was the problem. I just sighed. It was a deep, theatrical sigh, the kind that says, "I can't believe I have to do this, but you've left me no choice." I shook my head slowly, turned my back on Brenda without another word, and walked back towards my truck. The move was calculated. In a conflict, denying your opponent the last word is a small but potent victory. I gave Dr. Sharma a quick, reassuring nod. "Give me 2 minutes," I mouthed. Her eyes followed me, wide with a mixture of hope and confusion. Brenda, I could feel, was still standing there, radiating indignant fury at being so summarily dismissed. I got back in my F-250, and, with the practiced ease of someone who is parked in far tighter spots under far more pressure, I backed the trailer into a parking spot right next to the clinic's front door. The trailer itself was my pride and joy. It was a custom-built 15-foot box trailer painted a sleek, unassuming charcoal gray. It didn't look like much to the untrained eye, but inside was a 60 kilowatts diesel-powered medical-grade generator. It was insulated with 4 inches of sound-dampening foam, making it so quiet you could have a normal conversation standing right next to it. It had its own dedicated fuel tank, a sophisticated power regulation system, and enough clean, stable electricity to power a small operating room. I called it the Juice Moose. It was massive overkill for this situation, and that's what made it perfect. I hopped out, opened the side access panel, and revealed a neatly organized bank of outlets and connections. I grabbed the end of a thick, black, anaconda-sized power cable, a 100-amp feeder line that was worth more than my first car. I unspooled it, walked it over to the clinic's exterior wall where the main power conduit entered the building, and opened the building's own master breaker panel, a box Brenda thankfully didn't have a key to. With a few quick, practiced movements, I disconnected the main feed from the pole and connected the leads from my generator cable. It was a direct bypass. The utility company ceased to be part of the equation. The clinic was now an island, powered entirely by me. I walked back to the trailer, my boots crunching on the asphalt. The silence was thick with anticipation. The senior citizens were watching me like I was trying to defuse a bomb. Dr. Sharma was holding her breath. Brenda was staring, her mouth a thin, hard line, as if she was trying to figure out what new bylaw I was violating. I flipped a series of 3 switches on the control panel inside the Juice Moose. The first one glowed green, the second, amber. I paused for a dramatic second, then flipped the large red master switch. There was no roar, no coughing engine, just a deep, satisfying hum. A sound so low it was more of a feeling in your chest than a noise in your ears. It was quieter than the central air unit on the roof of the building. A moment later, a collective gasp went through the crowd. The lights inside the clinic flickered on. The big air conditioning unit on the roof sputtered to life with a loud thwump whoosh, blasting cool air over the waiting people. A spontaneous cheer erupted. It started with one of the old guys, a hearty "Atta boy," and then spread. People were clapping. Dr. Sharma's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated relief. She rushed inside to check on her refrigerators. I leaned back against the cool metal of my truck, crossed my arms, and allowed myself a small, tight smirk. I caught Brenda's eye. The smug satisfaction on her face had curdled, replaced by a look of sheer, sputtering disbelief, followed by the slow burning fire of pure rage. Her little kingdom had just been invaded by a foreign power, and she was utterly helpless to stop it. I gave her a little 2-fingered salute. "Okay, Brenda," I muttered under my breath, the rumble of the Juice Moose a comforting presence at my back. "Let's dance." The first volley in the HOA war wasn't fired with a weapon, but with a printer. The next morning, I went out to get my paper and found my property had been transformed into a sticky note art installation. There were 3 laminated violation notices zip-tied to my front door handle, 4 more tucked under the windshield wipers of my truck, and, in a breathtaking display of petty audacity, one taped squarely on the side of the Juice Moose itself, which was still humming away peacefully in the clinic parking lot. This wasn't just a counterattack. This was a full-blown paper-based shock and awe campaign. I peeled the notice off my front door and read it over my morning coffee. Oak Meadows Homeowners Association. Official notice of violation. Violation. 34F. Unauthorized long-term parking of a commercial trailer on association-managed property. Description: a large charcoal-colored trailer, approx 15 feet. has been parked in the commercial auxiliary lot for a period exceeding the 4-hour limit for service vehicles. Required action: immediate removal of said trailer. Fine if not remedied within 24 hours. $50 plus $25 for each subsequent day. I took a sip of coffee. The other notices were even better. Violation 88A, operation of industrial machinery causing noise pollution. Description: a generator or similar industrial engine is being operated continuously, creating a disruptive hum that violates the residents' right to peaceful enjoyment. This one made me laugh out loud. I had a decibel meter app on my phone. I'd measured the Juice Moose yesterday. It was running at a whisper quiet 52 decibels from 10 feet away. Brenda's own central air unit, located on the side of her house closest to the clinic, was chugging along at a robust 65. The best one was taped to the generator itself. Violation 2D, aesthetic disharmony. Description: the presence of the aforementioned industrial trailer and its associated thick, black cabling creates a visually jarring element that is incongruous with the established architectural and landscaping standards of the Oak Meadows community. Aesthetic disharmony. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic nonsense. It was so beautifully, perfectly meaningless. I spent the next hour at my kitchen table, not fuming, but composing. This was my turf now. I was a logistics guy. Paperwork was part of the job. I treated it like a mission briefing. I typed up 3 separate, formal responses, printed them on my company letterhead, and addressed them to the Oak Meadows HOA Board of Directors, care of President Brenda. For violation 34F, I wrote, per my lease agreement with the tenant of Commercial Unit 4B, Hopewell Medical Services, my equipment is classified not as parked, but as actively providing an essential utility under a service contract, exempting it from the 4-hour limit. Please see attached service agreement. I spent 20 minutes creating a very official-looking, backdated service agreement between Atlas Remote Solutions and Dr. Sharma's clinic. For violation 88A, I wrote, the equipment in question is a hospital-grade, sound-attenuated power unit operating at 52 dB, well below the 70 dB threshold for daytime noise, as stipulated by Municipal Ordinance 113.8. For reference, this is significantly quieter than standard residential air conditioning units within the community. Data available upon request. Therefore, it cannot be considered disruptive. And for my personal favorite, violation 2D, aesthetic disharmony, I simply wrote, objection noted. However, the visually jarring element is currently preventing the spoilage of vital public health assets and providing critical climate control for vulnerable members of our community. It is the position of Atlas Remote Solutions that functional harmony occasionally supersedes aesthetic harmony. Furthermore, the thick, black cabling is rated for 200 amps and is safely secured, unlike the precarious-looking flamingo lawn ornaments located at 121 Oak Drive, Brenda's address. I sealed each response in a separate envelope, drove to the post office, and sent them via certified mail with return receipt requested. It was an absurdly formal and expensive way to respond to a glorified sticky note, costing me almost $30. But the thought of Brenda having to sign for each piece of my meticulously crafted, sarcastic defiance? That was priceless. The war of attrition had begun. Brenda, it turned out, did not appreciate my legalistic rebuttal. When paperwork failed, she escalated to people with badges and guns. I was in my garage 2 afternoons later, sketching out a more permanent solution for the clinic's power issue, when I saw the flashing lights paint my driveway in strokes of red and blue. A patrol car from the county sheriff's department rolled to a stop at the curb. 2 deputies got out. One was young, with a fresh haircut and a crisp, new-looking uniform. He had the earnest, slightly overwhelmed look of a rookie. The other was not. He moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who was powered by dwindling reserves of caffeine and patience. His uniform was rumpled, his face was etched with the fine lines of 1,000 stupid calls, and he looked at my house like he was already tired of whatever was inside it. I walked out to meet them, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Afternoon, officers. Everything okay?" The rookie, whose name tag read Dave, stepped forward. "Sir, we received a call about an unauthorized power plant being operated at this subdivision." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. "An unauthorized power plant?" I pointed down the street towards the clinic. "You must mean the Juice Moose." The older officer, Miller, according to his tag, sighed. It was a profound sigh, a sigh that carried the weight of decades of domestic disputes and noise complaints. "The Juice Moose," he repeated, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion. "Right, ma'am, over there." He hooked a thumb in the direction of Brenda's house, where she was watching from her porch. "Claims you're running some kind of illegal operation." "With all due respect, officers," I said, keeping my tone friendly and helpful. "What I'm doing is providing temporary emergency power to a free vaccine clinic after the HOA president, that woman over there, illegally cut their main power line." Dave looked confused. "She cut their power?" "Locked the main breaker box and everything," I confirmed. "The clinic is for the elderly, the vaccines are temperature sensitive. It was a genuine emergency. My company specializes in this kind of thing. The equipment is fully licensed, insured, and quieter than her lawn sprinkler." Brenda must have sensed the tide was turning against her, because she marched across her perfect lawn and joined us on the sidewalk. "He's lying," she announced, pointing a finger at me. "He is operating a commercial enterprise out of his home. He has dangerous high-voltage cables running across public property, and he is creating a public nuisance." Officer Miller turned his weary gaze on her. It was a look that could curdle milk. "Ma'am, is it true you shut off power to that building?" "As president of the HOA, I was within my rights to enforce our bylaws," she shot back. Miller looked at my generator trailer, then back at Brenda. He looked at me. Then he let out another one of his epic sighs. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly monotone. "This is a top-of-the-line unit. I can barely hear it running from here. It's probably safer than the wiring in my own house. And as for the power, well, you admitted to turning it off, which, I gotta be honest, sounds a whole lot more like a crime than what he's doing. Vandalism, maybe. Reckless endangerment, even." Brenda's face went white. "I did not." "You did," Miller said calmly. "You told us you did when you called. Now, this seems to me to be a civil matter, an HOA matter, a 'please God don't call us for this again' matter." He turned to me. "Sir, is your equipment secured?" "Yes, sir. Clearly marked. Cables are covered. Everything's up to code." He nodded slowly. "Good. Then we're done here." He looked back at Brenda, his eyes narrowed. "Ma'am, I suggest you resolve this through the proper channels, and I suggest you stop calling 911 for bylaw disputes." With that, he and Dave turned and walked back to their car. As he got in, Officer Miller caught my eye and gave me a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. It was the universal sign for, "I get it, man. Good luck." They drove away, leaving me on the sidewalk with a fuming, utterly defeated Brenda. Her ultimate weapon, an appeal to a higher authority, had backfired spectacularly. She stared at me, her eyes promising retribution, before turning on her heel and storming back into her house. The front door slammed with a force that probably violated some other noise ordinance. I smiled. Phase 2 of the war was a decisive victory, but I knew this was far from over. Brenda wasn't the type to accept defeat. She was the type to retreat, rearm, and find a much bigger gun. The Juice Moose was a magnificent beast, but it wasn't a permanent solution. It ran on diesel, which cost money. It was still a trailer, which gave Brenda a target, no matter how legally sound my arguments were. And frankly, the idea of having to refuel it every few days for the foreseeable future, all while under the baleful glare of my neighbor, was exhausting. I needed to end the siege. I needed to build a fortress. The idea came to me while I was looking at the blueprints for my house. My property line backed up to the commercial lot where the clinic was located. My main electrical panel, a heavy-duty 200-amp service, was on that same wall. The distance from my panel to the clinic's exterior wall was less than 50 feet. The plan was audacious. It was ridiculous. It was beautiful. I was going to hardwire the clinic directly to my house. I'd install a secondary meter, run a dedicated, armored power line buried in a trench, and essentially lease them electricity. They'd pay me for what they used. I'd pay the utility bill. Brenda could no longer touch their power source without physically invading my property. It was the electrical equivalent of a mutual defense pact. But for something this crazy, I couldn't just do it myself. I needed permits. I needed inspections. I needed a licensed contractor who was as nuts as I was. I knew just the guy. Gus Antonelli had been a master electrician for 40 years. He was semi-retired, meaning he only took jobs that interested him, which usually meant they were either incredibly complex or incredibly weird. He was a grizzled, cynical 70-year-old with hands like leather and a worldview forged in the fires of dealing with neurotic homeowners. I called him. I didn't even get to finish my explanation before he cut me off. Wait, his gravelly voice crackled over the phone. Oak Meadows? The HOA run by that blonde woman who looks like she inspects her lawn with a ruler? That's the one, Brenda. Gus let out a cackle. Oh, I know Brenda. I did a kitchen remodel for the Garcias 3 years ago. She tried to find them because my work van had a spot of rust on the fender, said it was a visual blight. So what fresh hell has she cooked up now? I told him the whole story. The clinic, the locked breaker, the Juice Moose, the cops. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Let me get this straight, he finally said, and I could hear him chewing on the unlit cigar that was perpetually clamped in his teeth. The dragon lady of the HOA cut the power to a charity clinic full of old people, so you brought in a portable nuke reactor to run it, and now you want to tunnel under her spiritual territory to hardwire the joint to your house, just to spite her? Not just to spite her, I clarified. Mostly. It's also the right thing to do. Son, Gus said, and I could hear the grin in his voice. The right thing to do is gonna cost you about $5,000 in armored cable, conduit, and trenching fees. Spiting Brenda is just the bonus. A big, beautiful, expensive bonus. He paused. I love it. I'm in. I'll be over this afternoon to take a look. We'll need to pull city permits, get a survey done for underground utilities. This is gonna be a beautiful, beautiful mess. Gus showed up a few hours later. His rust-spotted but perfectly functional van parked defiantly at the curb. He surveyed the scene, walking the 50-foot path from my panel to the clinic, kicking at the turf, muttering to himself. Yeah, this is doable, he declared, pulling out a measuring tape. Easy trench. We'll have to go down 36 inches to be up to code. The city permitting office is a pain in the ass, but they hate HOAs more than they hate contractors, so they'll probably fast-track it just for the fun of it. He looked over at Brenda's house, where the curtains in the front window twitched. She's watching, you know. I'm counting on it, I said. Gus grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. I'm gonna enjoy this, kid. I haven't had a good war with an HOA since '09. The one in Pine Ridge tried to tell me my extension cords weren't the right shade of orange. He clapped me on the shoulder. I'll get the permit application filed tomorrow morning. You just keep the Juice Moose juicing. The real fun starts when we bring in the trencher. The constant, low hum of the juice moose became the new soundtrack of the neighborhood. And like any controversial new song, everyone had an opinion. The conflict was no longer a private affair between me, Brenda, and the clinic. It had gone public. The primary battlefield was the unofficial Oak Meadows Neighborhood Watch Facebook group. It was usually a sleepy forum for posting about lost cats and complaining about people who didn't pick up after their dogs. Overnight, it had become the digital equivalent of a town square shouting match. Brenda's cronies formed the first faction. There was Carol, the HOA secretary, who posted long, rambling screeds about protecting our investment and the dangerous precedent being set. She used a lot of capital letters and exclamation points. Another neighbor, a guy named Todd who washed his Lexus 3 times a week, chimed in about how the clinic was an eyesore and worried about the element it attracted. It was all thinly veiled snobbery, dressed up as civic concern. But then, Team Jack started to emerge. It began subtly. Someone posted a picture of the clinic with a simple caption, "So glad my 88-year-old mother could get her booster shot right here in the neighborhood. Thank you to the clinic and to the person providing the power." The post got over 100 likes in an hour. The comment section became a war zone. For every, "He's violating the bylaws," there were 3, "Brenda is out of control," or, "Thank God someone finally stood up to her." The support started bleeding over from the digital world into the real one. One morning, I found a 6-pack of a good local IPA sitting on my front porch. The attached note, written on a napkin, just said, "Keep fighting the good fight." A neighbor. A few days later, a woman I barely knew stopped her minivan while I was getting the mail. She rolled down her window and said, "My dad is in a wheelchair. Getting him to the county center is an all-day ordeal. What you're doing for that clinic, thank you." My favorite ally was Mr. Henderson from 2 streets over. He was a quiet widower in his late 70s, a man I'd only ever exchanged polite nods with. He'd gotten his shot on the 2nd day the clinic was open. Now, every time he drove or walked past my house, if Brenda was visible anywhere, in her yard, on her porch, peering through her window, he would make a grand, theatrical show of giving me a huge, enthusiastic thumbs up and a booming, "Keep up the great work, son." The look on Brenda's face each time was a tiny, delicious victory. Not everyone was so bold. I had a few hushed, conspiratorial conversations over the fence with neighbors who would praise me in whispers, constantly looking over their shoulder towards Brenda's house as if she had sniper nests set up in her attic. They were terrified of getting on her bad side, of receiving a violation for their garbage cans being out an hour too long, or their garden gnome being an unapproved height. It was clear the community was a powder keg that had been waiting for a spark. For years, people had just put up with Brenda's reign of terror because it was easier than fighting. They paid the ridiculous fines, they adjusted their lives to her whims, they kept their heads down. But now, the sight of my generator, the symbol of my defiance, humming away day and night, had given them a flicker of hope. I wasn't just fighting for a clinic anymore. I was fighting for everyone who was tired of being told what color their front door could be. I was the reluctant general of a suburban insurgency, and the enemy was a 50-something woman with a clipboard and a god complex. And with Gus and his trencher on the way, we were about to open up a new front. The day the war went subterranean began with the arrival of Gus's secret weapon, a bright orange Ditch Witch SK-800. It wasn't a massive excavator, but a compact, powerful stand-on trencher that looked like a chariot of war for a very serious gardener. Gus unloaded it from his trailer, his unlit cigar clamped in his teeth, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "Morning," he grunted, handing me a crisp sheet of paper. "City permit. Approved and stamped yesterday afternoon. They didn't even ask any questions, just said going up against an HOA? Godspeed." We're cleared to dig. The plan was simple. A 50-foot trench, 6 inches wide and 3 feet deep, running in a perfectly straight line from the side of my house to the clinic's property. Operation Trojan Trench was a go. Gus fired up the ditch witch. The machine roared to life, a stark contrast to the gentle hum of the juice moose. This was not a sound of quiet defiance. This was a declaration of intent. He lowered the heavy, chainsaw-like boom, and it began to chew into my perfectly manicured lawn, spitting out a neat pile of dirt and sod. We'd made it about 10 feet when the inevitable happened. Brenda's front door flew open. She marched across her lawn, not with a clipboard this time, but with a look of apocalyptic fury. She was wearing what I could only describe as battle khakis. "Cease and desist!" she shrieked over the noise of the engine. Gus, a true professional, ignored her and kept trenching. "I am talking to you!" she screamed, getting closer. Gus calmly killed the engine, the sudden silence almost as jarring as the noise. He turned, took the cigar out of his mouth, and looked at her. "Ma'am, can I help you?" "You are destroying association property," she accused, pointing a trembling finger at the neat line of excavated earth. "You are violating the subterranean root integrity of the common area Bradford pears." The pear trees in question were a good 40 feet away. Gus looked at the trees, then at the trench, then back at her. "Lady, the roots of those glorified weeds are nowhere near my trench. And this isn't common property, this is his lawn," he said, hooking a thumb at me. "And we have a permit from the city to install a utility line, a permit that supersedes your little garden club rule book." Brenda's face was turning a fascinating shade of plum. "I will not allow this. This is unauthorized construction." And then she did it. She marched right up to the trencher and stood directly in its path, planting her feet like she was holding the pass at Thermopylae. "You will not dig another inch." Gus and I just stared. My neighbors, who had been peeking from behind their curtains, were now openly standing in their driveways, phones out, recording the spectacle. A woman in beige capris was facing down a piece of industrial machinery over the hypothetical safety of tree roots. It was the most suburban standoff imaginable. Gus sighed, hopped off the machine, and pulled a camp chair from his truck. He set it up, sat down, and finally lit his cigar. "All right," he said to me, puffing away. "Gonna be one of those days?" I walked over to Brenda. "Brenda, you need to move. This is permitted work. You are interfering with a licensed contractor." "I am protecting this community from your reckless disregard for our rules," she retorted, not budging an inch. The standoff lasted for 20 glorious, agonizing minutes. Gus sat and smoked. I tried to reason with her. She quoted bylaws about landscaping. The neighborhood audience grew. It was better than reality TV. Finally, Gus took a long drag from his cigar, stood up, and pulled out his phone. "Okay, that's enough of this circus," he grumbled. He dialed. "Yeah, hi, Officer Miller. It's Gus Antonelli. Yeah, the electrician. Hey, remember that HOA situation over on Oak Drive? Well, we're back, and this time the lady is standing in front of my trencher." "Yeah, a human barricade." "Okay, see you in 5. Brenda paled slightly at the mention of Miller's name. The impending arrival of her least favorite police officer was, apparently, the one thing that could pierce her armor of righteous indignation. She held her ground for another minute, a last gasp of defiance, but when the distant wail of a siren became audible, she finally broke. With a final, hateful glare at me, she turned on her heel and retreated to her fortress of solitude. Gus waited for her door to slam, then took one last puff of his cigar and stamped it out. "Right," he said, climbing back onto the ditch witch. "Where were we?" The engine roared back to life, and the battle for the underground resumed. The trench was a thing of beauty, straight, clean, and deep. Gus and his guys laid the heavy gray PVC conduit, ran the thick, armored cable through it, and had it all inspected by the city before lunch the next day. The city inspector, a cheerful guy named Frank, gave it a passing glance, winked at me and said, "Stick it to the man," before signing the paperwork. We had won the Battle of the Trench, but Brenda, I was about to find out, had access to weapons far more terrifying than a ditch witch. 2 days later, a man in a suit that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment knocked on my door. He wasn't a salesman. He didn't smile. He just handed me a thick, cream-colored envelope with the name of a prestigious downtown law firm embossed on the flap. "You've been served," he said, and walked away. I closed the door, my heart suddenly beating a little faster. This felt different. This wasn't a laminated notice or a pointless call to the cops. This was the big leagues. I sat down at my kitchen table and opened the envelope. The letter inside was 10 pages long. It was a formal cease and desist, and it was a masterpiece of legal intimidation. It used words like tortious interference, willful negligence, and indemnification. It accused me of creating an imminent and ongoing threat to public safety, of causing irreparable harm to the community's aesthetic and financial value, and of engaging in an unlawful conspiracy with the clinic to circumvent HOA authority. It demanded that I immediately cease all work, remove the buried conduit, disconnect the generator, and pay an initial sum of $25,000 for damages and legal fees incurred by the association. If I failed to comply within 48 hours, the HOA would pursue all available legal remedies, including but not limited to a civil lawsuit and a court-ordered injunction. I read it twice, then a third time. The casual, humorous defiance I'd felt up to this point evaporated, replaced by a cold knot of dread in my stomach. The generator was fun, the trench was a statement, but lawyers were a different kind of enemy. They didn't fight with logic or common sense. They fought with money and time, and they usually had more of both than you did. For the first time, I felt a genuine pang of fear. I looked around my house, at the life I'd built after getting out of the military. Was I really about to risk all this over a feud with my crazy neighbor? Was it worth my savings, my business, my peace of mind? The thought of being buried in legal fees, of having to fight a protracted, expensive court battle, was terrifying. I had a moment of profound doubt. Maybe I should just cut my losses, disconnect the generator, apologize, and let Brenda have her miserable little victory. That evening, feeling defeated, I went down to the clinic to tell Dr. Sharma the bad news. The trench was filled in, the sod neatly replaced, but the final connection to my house hadn't been made yet. The juice moose was still humming away, a faithful sentry. I walked inside. The waiting area was empty, the day's work done. Dr. Sharma was at her desk, going over paperwork. She looked up and gave me a tired but genuine smile. "Jack, come in. Can I get you a coffee?" "No thanks, Anya," I said, my voice heavy. I handed her the letter. "You should see this." She read it, her brow furrowed, her smile faded. "Oh, Jack, this is serious." "It is," I said. I think I might be in over my head here. I don't know if I can fight this." She put the letter down and looked at me, her eyes full of a quiet intensity. "Do you know how many people we saw today?" 42. We administered 42 booster shots to people over the age of 70. We gave a first dose to a young woman who's a cancer survivor and has been too afraid to go to the big county hub. Her husband almost cried. He was so relieved. She stood up and walked over to a small whiteboard. On it were dozens of little colorful sticky notes. "These are from our patients," she said. "Thank you notes. Little drawings from their grandkids. This one says, 'God bless you for being here.' This one says, It's so nice not to have to drive for an hour. She turned back to me. What you're doing, Jack, it's not just about power. You're keeping this place open. You're letting us do this for all these people. This is important. What she's doing, she tapped the lawyer's letter with her finger, is just noise. What we're doing, this matters. Don't let her win. I looked at the whiteboard, at the scrawled, heartfelt messages. I looked at Dr. Sharma's determined face, and the knot of fear in my stomach was replaced by a slow burning anger. Brenda had come after my property. She had come after my business. Now she was trying to shut down something that was genuinely good, something that was helping people. She had crossed a line. My resolve hardened. This was no longer just a spat. This was a matter of principle. Okay, I said, my voice clear and steady again. She wants a war? She's got one. Brenda, armed with her high-priced legal eagles, prepared her kill shot. An official-looking notice was posted on the community message board and emailed to every resident. Subject: urgent. Oak Meadows HOA Emergency General Meeting. Purpose: to discuss and vote upon recent flagrant bylaw violations by a resident that threatened the integrity and harmony of our community. Agenda items to include: 1. The levying of a special assessment, fine of $10,000 against the offending party. J. Reardon, 117 Oak Drive. 2. The ratification of Emergency Bylaw 112 JAS, prohibiting the transfer of private residential utilities to commercial lots. 3. Further legal actions as deemed necessary by the board. It was a public execution, scheduled for Thursday night at the community clubhouse. This was her arena. She wasn't just trying to beat me, she was trying to humiliate me. She wanted to turn the entire neighborhood against me, to make an example of me so that no one would ever dare question her authority again. She would have a PowerPoint presentation, I was sure of it. There would be charts. My first instinct was to hide, to let them have their meeting and deal with the fallout later. Public speaking wasn't my forte. I was a man of action, of logistics and mechanics. I solved problems with wrenches and wiring, not with rhetoric. The thought of standing up in a room full of my neighbors while Brenda painted me as the villain of Oak Meadows made my stomach churn. I called Gus. "So, the Dragon Lady has called a public tribunal," he said after I read him the notice. "Classic move. She controls the forum, she controls the narrative." "What do I do, Gus? I'm not a lawyer. I can't fight her on bylaw technicalities." "Don't," he grunted. "Don't even try. That's her home turf. You try to argue bylaws with that woman, she'll tie you in knots. You gotta fight her on your turf." "My turf is my garage, Gus. I can't exactly bring the whole neighborhood in here." "No, kid," he said, his voice patient. "Your turf is common sense. Your turf is the truth. Don't talk about bylaws. Talk about the old folks. Talk about the vaccines. Talk about how she locked them out in the heat. Don't make it about rules. Make it about right and wrong. People understand that a lot better than they understand subsection C of paragraph 4. He was right. I couldn't out Brenda. But I could be me. I spent the next 2 days preparing, not by reading the HOA covenants, but by talking to Dr. Sharma. I got the exact numbers. 347 people vaccinated so far. I got a copy of her non-profit registration. I had Gus write up a formal statement detailing how all the electrical work was permitted and up to code. I wasn't building a legal defense. I was building a case for human decency. The night of the meeting, I put on a clean, collared shirt. The nicest one I owned that didn't have a small grease stain on it. I felt like a man walking toward a firing squad, but my resolve was firm. I grabbed my folder of documents and walked out the door. The clubhouse was just down the street. As I walked, the juice moose hummed its quiet, steady song in the evening air. It was a reminder of how this all started. A symbol of a simple, pragmatic solution to a manufactured problem. Brenda wanted to make this complicated, to wrap it in layers of rules and legalese. My job was to cut through all of it. My job was to walk into that room, stand my ground, and remind everyone what this was really about. I wasn't nervous anymore. I was ready. The clubhouse buzzed with the tense, gossipy energy of a high school cafeteria before a big fight. The room was packed, a standing-room-only crowd of my neighbors, their faces a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and outright hostility. I saw Brenda's cronies, Carol and Todd, sitting in the front row like an eager jury. I saw other, friendlier faces in the back, people who had given me quiet encouragement. And in the middle were the undecideds, the ones who just wanted the drama to end. Brenda stood at a podium at the front of the room, looking every bit the conquering queen. She wore a severe navy blue blazer, her hair a formidable blonde helmet. Next to her was a large screen, the first slide of her PowerPoint presentation already glowing ominously. Protecting our community, an examination of recent bylaw infractions. I took a seat in the front row, right in her line of sight, and placed my folder on my lap. I wanted her to see I hadn't come empty-handed. She began, her voice smooth and practiced. Thank you all for coming to this urgent meeting. As you know, our community is governed by a set of covenants designed to protect our shared quality of life and, frankly, our property values. What followed was a 20-minute masterclass in manipulative rhetoric. She clicked through slides with damning photos. There was the Juice Moose, shot from a low angle to make it look like a menacing monolith. There was a close-up of the power cable, which she called a hazardous, unsightly tripwire. There was a dramatic, out-of-focus shot of my trenching operation, making it look like the Battle of the Somme had occurred on my front lawn. She spoke of rogue elements, of flagrant disregard for the rules we all agree to live by, and the dangerous precedent of allowing one individual to operate outside the bounds of our community standards. She never once mentioned the clinic, the vaccines, or the elderly. She framed the entire conflict as me, the outsider, versus the peaceful, orderly community she was sworn to protect. By the time she was done, a low murmur of agreement was rippling through her supporters. She had painted a compelling picture. I was the bad guy. And so, she concluded, her voice ringing with authority. The board proposes a fine of $10,000 to cover the damages and to send a clear message that this behavior will not be tolerated. All in favor? Wait. My voice cut through the room, louder and steadier than I expected. I believe I have a right to speak. Brenda looked annoyed, but the HOA charter gave me the floor. The floor recognizes Mr. Reardon, she said, her tone dripping with condescension. You have 5 minutes. I walked to the podium, leaving my folder on the chair. I didn't need notes. I turned to face my neighbors. Good evening, I started, my heart pounding. My name is Jack Reardon. Most of you know me as the guy with the big truck. Lately, you probably know me as the guy with the generator. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room. Brenda has shown you a lot of pictures tonight, I said, gesturing to the screen. Pictures of my equipment, my lawn. She's talked a lot about rules and bylaws. And she's right. I did park a trailer. I did operate a generator. I did dig a trench. What she failed to mention is why. I took a breath. This whole thing started because Brenda decided that a small sign on a non-profit free vaccine clinic was an aesthetic emergency. So she took it upon herself to cut power to that clinic, in the middle of a July afternoon, with dozens of our elderly neighbors waiting outside for their shots, and with thousands of dollars of temperature-sensitive vaccines inside. The murmur in the room changed. It was no longer agreement with Brenda, but a low buzz of surprise. Many people clearly hadn't heard this part of the story. I didn't bring in my generator to break rules, I continued, my voice gaining strength. I did it to solve a problem that she created. I'm not a politician. I'm not a lawyer. I'm an engineer. I see a problem, I fix it. And the problem here wasn't a zoning violation. The problem was our neighbors being put at risk over the font on a sign. I looked around the room, making eye contact. This isn't about property values. It's about our values as a community. Is this a place where we help each other? Or is this a place where we hide behind a rule book to bully people? You can fine me. You can pass a new rule. But it won't change the fact that what started this was just plain wrong. I finished, my ears ringing in the sudden silence. I had no idea if I had gotten through to anyone. I walked back to my seat, my part in this done. Brenda stepped back up to the podium, a smug look on her face, ready to deliver the final blow. "A very touching story," she said sarcastically. "But emotion doesn't supersede our legal covenants. It is time to vote." Brenda raised her gavel-like pen, ready to call the question that would seal my fate. She had the momentum. My speech had swayed some, but her base was solid, and the undecideds were likely to side with the perceived authority in the room. I could see her tasting the victory. "All in favor of levying the fine against Mr. Reardon?" she began. A hand went up in the back of the room. It wasn't a tentative hand. It was raised with a calm, steady certainty. Every head turned. It was Mr. Henderson. Quiet, unassuming Mr. Henderson, who had been sitting silently in the back row the entire time. Brenda's face tightened with annoyance. "Mr. Henderson, the time for public comment is over." "I'm aware of that, Brenda," he said, his voice surprisingly firm and clear, carrying easily across the room. He stood up and began to walk slowly towards the podium. He wasn't frail. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried purpose. "But I believe I have a point of order that is relevant to the vote." A point of order. The term had a legal weight that made Brenda hesitate. She couldn't just shut him down without looking like a tyrant. "Very well, Mr. Henderson," she said through gritted teeth. "State your point." Mr. Henderson arrived at the podium. He was wearing a simple tweed jacket and glasses. He looked like everyone's favorite grandfather. He turned and surveyed the room, his gaze calm and intelligent. "Good evening, neighbors," he began. "For those who don't know me, my name is Arthur Henderson. I've lived at 214 Azalea Lane for 35 years. He then turned his attention to Brenda. "Brenda," he said, his tone polite but firm. "You've quoted a lot of HOA bylaws tonight. You've done your homework on those, but you seem to have missed a few rather important state and federal statutes." A hush fell over the room. "Before I retired to spend more time with my garden," Mr. Henderson continued, a faint, wry smile on his lips, "I was a senior partner at the law firm of Sullivan, Cromwell, and Pierce downtown. My specialty for 40 years was utility and real estate law." You could have heard a pin drop. Brenda's smug expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Gus, who was standing against the back wall, let out a low whistle. Mr. Henderson continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a lecturer. "First, let's talk about the power. The state's Public Utility Commission Code, specifically Section 394.5, makes it explicitly illegal for any unauthorized party to tamper with or deny access to essential utility services. By cutting that lock and shutting off the power, you didn't just violate an HOA rule, Brenda. You likely committed a misdemeanor." Brenda went pale. "Second," he went on, holding up 2 fingers, "the clinic. As a registered 501(c)(3) non-profit providing a designated public health service, they are afforded special protections under both state and federal law, particularly when operating on commercially zoned property. The idea that an HOA's aesthetic code about signage could supersede their right to operate is, to use a legal term, laughable." He wasn't shouting. He wasn't being dramatic. He was simply stating facts, and it was devastating. "Which brings me to my final point," Mr. Henderson said, looking directly at Brenda, his kindly grandfather facade completely gone, replaced by a razor-sharp legal mind. The letter from your law firm, which I had Mr. Reardon show me this afternoon, by using HOA funds, our money, to hire a law firm to intimidate a resident who was, in fact, remedying a public health hazard you created, you have exposed this board, and potentially yourself, personally, to a significant civil rights lawsuit. We're talking about punitive damages. We're talking about a legal battle that could bankrupt this association. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. So the question tonight isn't whether you should fine Mr. Reardon $10,000. The question is whether this board wishes to authorize spending $100,000 to defend an illegal and, frankly, immoral action. He looked around the room. I, for one, would vote against that. Mr. Henderson finished, gave a slight nod, and walked slowly back to his seat. The silence he left in his wake was absolute. He had not just dismantled Brenda's argument, he had vaporized it. He had taken her rulebook and set it on fire with the United States Legal Code. Brenda stood at the podium, speechless, her face a mask of horrified disbelief. The game was over. She just didn't know it yet. The silence in the clubhouse was deafening. It stretched for a full 10 seconds, a vacuum where Brenda's authority used to be. Then, it was broken by a low murmur that quickly swelled into a buzz of conversation. People were turning to each other, their expressions a mixture of shock, anger, and dawning realization. They hadn't just been ruled by a stickler, they'd been led by a liability. Brenda stood frozen, her mouth slightly agape. Her carefully constructed world had been demolished in 3 minutes by a retired man in a tweed jacket. From the back of the room, a voice called out, "I'd like to withdraw the motion to fine Mr. Reardon." "Seconded!" another voice yelled. Brenda, snapping out of her stupor, tried to regain control. "There is no withdrawal. The motion is on the floor," she said, her voice strained and shrill. But the tide had turned. The fear was gone, replaced by righteous indignation. "I call for a vote on the motion, then!" someone shouted. "Let's get it over with!" Brenda, trapped, had no choice. "All in favor of the fine?" she asked, her voice trembling. Carol and Todd, her loyal disciples, raised their hands. They were the only two. All opposed? A forest of hands went up. It was nearly unanimous. A wave of relief and quiet applause swept through the room. I felt a hand clap my shoulder and turned to see Gus grinning at me. "Told you, kid. Common sense." But the neighborhood wasn't done. A woman from the back of the room stood up. "I'd like to make a new motion," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I move for a vote of no confidence in Brenda as president of the Homeowners Association." The room erupted. "Second!" "Yes." "It's about time." Brenda's face, which had been pale, now turned a blotchy, furious red. "This is not on the agenda. This is an illegal meeting." Mr. Henderson stood up again, a quiet pillar of authority. "According to our own charter, Article 5, Section 3, a motion for a vote of no confidence can be raised from the floor at any general meeting, provided a quorum is present. And I believe," he said, looking around the packed room, "we have a quorum." It was the final, fatal blow. Brenda looked around at the sea of hostile faces, at the neighbors she had fined and harassed for years, and saw that she had no allies left. The power she had so carefully cultivated had vanished. She imploded. "Fine!" she shrieked, slamming her hand on the podium. "Have your little coup. You are all ruining this neighborhood. It was perfect before you all started ignoring the rules. You'll be sorry when the property values plummet and this place looks like a trash heap." With that, she grabbed her purse and her now useless folder, stormed down the center aisle, and shoved her way out of the clubhouse door, slamming it behind her. A stunned silence fell for a moment, and then the room exploded into applause and relieved, happy chatter. People were shaking my hand, clapping Mr. Henderson on the back. It was over. The reign of Queen Brenda had come to a swift and dramatic end. The next morning, the air in Oak Meadows felt different, lighter. The oppressive weight of Brenda's constant surveillance was gone. People were smiling at each other. I saw two neighbors, who I knew had been feuding for months over the placement of a basketball hoop, having a friendly chat by their mailboxes. It was like the end of a long, dreary winter. Gus and his crew arrived early, and the mood was downright cheerful. "Heard there was a regime change last night," Gus said, handing me a coffee as he got out of his van. "Good riddance." They worked efficiently, without the threat of a human barricade. The final connections were made. Gus flipped the heavy breakers in my main panel, and then we went down to the clinic. He disconnected the big feeder cable from the Juice Moose, and with a quiet click, plugged the clinic into its new permanent power source, my house. The lights inside didn't even flicker. Dr. Sharma came out, holding a large box of donuts. "On the house," she said, beaming. "To the heroes of Oak Meadows." Gus, covered in dirt, just grunted and took two. Later that week, I got a call from the new interim HOA president, a reasonable woman named Maria who lived a few streets over. She apologized profusely for the whole ordeal and asked if I'd be willing to join a committee to review and revise some of the HOA's more overzealous bylaws. I respectfully declined, saying I thought my days as a community activist were over. The best news came 2 weeks later. A large "For Sale" sign was hammered into Brenda's immaculate front lawn. Apparently, living in a community she could no longer micromanage was unbearable. I watched from my porch as the real estate agent planted the sign. I couldn't help but smile. Life settled into a new, more peaceful normal. The clinic thrived. The Juice Moose was back in my driveway, clean and ready for the next real disaster. I got my first check from Dr. Sharma for the electricity, along with another box of donuts. One Saturday afternoon, I was sitting on my front porch, enjoying the quiet. Mr. Henderson walked by on his afternoon constitutional. "Afternoon, Arthur," I said. "Jack," he replied with a nod. He stopped and looked at my house, then at the clinic down the street. "You know, for a man who claims not to be a community activist, you started quite the revolution." "I'm just an engineer, Arthur," I said with a laugh. "I just wanted to keep the lights on." He smiled. "Sometimes that's all it takes." He continued on his walk, and I was left alone with my thoughts. I looked at the peaceful, tree-lined street, at the neighbors washing their cars and kids riding their bikes. This whole insane saga, this HOA war that had consumed my life for weeks, had started with one person's petty need for control and ended with a community rediscovering its own common sense. It was a battle I never wanted, but a victory that felt surprisingly sweet. I raised my coffee mug in a silent toast. To the Juice Moose, the quiet hero of the war. To Gus and his glorious trencher. And to the surprise legal cavalry who rode in at the last minute. Goes to show, I mused to myself, taking a sip. There's no problem on earth that can't be solved with a little bit of spite, a lot of amperage, and a retired lawyer who's been waiting 20 years to drop the hammer.